Is lead round nose enough? We have some Sellier and Bellot 38 Special and 32 Smith & Wesson long lead round nose. And even though it says LRN right on the box, that 32 is kind of a little bit of a flat nose there. But I tested these rounds in my longer barrel 4-inch barrel revolvers in the past, and some people were wanting to see what these would do through the snub nose revolver. So I thought I'd bring these out and show what they'll do. Interesting enough, this 38 Special, that is a 158 grain, and what I got through my 4-inch 686 was 931 feet per second, 304 foot-pounds energy. So that is a pretty warm load, likely because it's loaded under CIP spec, so it's going to be a little bit warmer than typical American ammo. And then with our 32 long, that is a 100 grain, and through my 4.2-inch SP101, I got 779 feet per second, 135 foot-pounds energy. So that's pretty typical power for a 32 long. So today we're going to test them through my 2-inch barrel Taurus 605 and my 1.875-inch barrel Ruger LCR. This is a 357 Magnum revolver. That's a 327 Federal. So we're going to go through the chronograph, see what kind of velocity and accuracy I get at the same time. Then I'm going to do my 10% clear ballistic gel test. So I'm going to go into plain 10% clear ballistics to see what the best potential of those are. You know, no rib simulation that can slow down its penetration. Then we'll move on to doing more of a real world simulation where I'm going to have 4 layers of t-shirt material on this first 3-inch piece that represents hitting a pectoral muscle, followed by a 1/4 inch medium density fiberboard that represents hitting ribs or sternum, 16 more inches of clear ballistics, then another 1/4 inch MDF at the back to represent hitting back ribs. That'll be our real world simulation. That's going to represent hitting like ribs and stuff like that. So we'll do a plain clear ballistic shot, then a real world simulation shot, and then I will shoot at the steel target to see what kind of practical accuracy and shootability I can get with these. So let's get started with this test. All right, first up we'll run our 38 Special 158 grain lead round nose. This ammo gave me 931 feet per second on average through a 4-inch barrel. Let's see what we get through a 2-inch barrel. $751, 826, 830, 857, 819. So a pretty good velocity spread there. That first one being pretty low. Now our 32 Smith & Wesson long through the 4.2-inch SP101, this gave me 779 feet per second. Let's see if we get through the little snub here. $735, 739, 731, 735, 730. So very consistent velocity and barely any loss from the 4.2-inch barrel down to the 1.875-inch, and that's likely due to, you know, this round is not particularly powerful, so you're not going to keep gaining and gaining and gaining. Like if you went to a 6-inch barrel, you probably have less velocity than through a 4-inch barrel does. But this has a lot less recoil than the 38 Special. So let's hit our ballistics gel block and see how these compare. All right, first up we'll run our 38 Special lead round nose into our plain clear ballistics. There's no rib simulation that can slow down its potential for penetration. So let's see what we get here with our 38 Special. All right. Let's hit that with our 32 Smith & Wesson long. Let's go take a look. All right, so I pretty much knew that was going to happen with the 38 Special, where it was going to arc around, because that's what's pretty typical with this. And it does a lot of tumbling. We can see a ton of tumbling damage in there. So what's interesting about this is it basically does kind of what a Fort Scott TUI does, but in my experience, it does it more predictably, more reliably. You know, there's not any real damage going to this first 3-inch piece here. There's a little bit more with the 38 than the 32, but once we get to about the 6-7 inch mark, it starts to tumble, and it's definitely at least yawing, and at least did one rotation because its back nose forward, and it went down to about 16 3/4 inches of penetration. So that's a really good penetration number for not being a hollow point, and it did a lot of damage in there. Now our 32 long, because it is a little bit of a flat point, it didn't tumble, and we got a penetration of about, I'll say about 12 3/4 inches. Sometimes parallax will throw that off, the camera's parallax, but yeah, both of those hit adequate penetration depths without over penetrating, so that's not too bad overall. Let's put in our rib simulation, put on our fabric, even though the fabric's redundant, and see how these do in our real world simulation. All right, our real world simulation, 4 layers of t-shirt material followed by 3 inches of clear ballistics to represent hitting a pectoral muscle, followed by a 1/4 inch medium density fiberboard to represent hitting ribs or sternum, 16 more inches of clear ballistics, and another 1/4 inch MDF at the back to represent hitting back ribs. You got to remember, this is a half representation of the density of flesh, so 3-inch pectoral is more like really 1.5 inches in real living flesh, and half everything else in the gel. So if you got like 16 inches in the gel, it'd be like 8 inches in a real living target. So real world simulation. Let's see how our 38 special does. All right. Wow. Set that with our 32 Smith & Wesson long. Let's go take a look. All right, so I was not expecting that, because through the 4-inch barrel, the 38 did not penetrate that far. But because you can clearly see it didn't tumble this time, it went really deep. Now, I would not necessarily consider that a whole lot of over penetration, but definitely over penetrated. If we take a look here at our rib simulation, both those went through straight, so that's good. And it's highly unlikely I'll see a tumbling mark through our back rib simulation. It is yawing through just a little bit. Huh. So generally I like to say if it stays within 3 inches past the back rib simulation, it wouldn't technically over penetrate or pass through an average size individual, just based on a lot of the math that I have done. So the rib simulation is at 19 inches. This bullet went to about 22.5. So if that were really going to go through an average size individual, it's likely that the clothing on the back of them would stop that bullet. So it would penetrate really deep, but it wouldn't be really a significant danger to bystanders or anything like that. Now what's interesting is our 32 long did almost exactly the same thing, almost exactly the same penetration and everything. That went to about 12 1/4 inches. So our 32 long was actually a little bit more consistent, predictable, and easier to shoot, but our 38 over penetrated in our real world simulation shot because it's a little bit less predictable with that round nose. So this is interesting here. When we look at the energy numbers of our 32, a lot of people say, well, that doesn't have enough energy, whatever. And a 22 long rifle out of a rifle has more energy, therefore it's better than this. And really, energy doesn't matter to a point. It matters enough to get enough penetration and damage and all of that, but at a certain point, it doesn't matter. Like, if you look at like a 22 long rifle, or even out of a pistol, I can get close to 100 foot-pounds energy out of a 22 pistol. Well, a compound bow will give you like half that energy, yet that'll go through 2 sides of a deer and be significantly more effective because there's so much mass to that arrow compared to a light little bullet. And it's the same thing with this. You know, we're not talking a little 22, we're talking a 100 grain bullet, which is going to keep plowing through the target. So 32 long is going to be significantly more effective than 22 long rifle or something like that, even though the energy is going to be pretty similar. So I just thought I would point that out. So I think the 32 long would be a good choice. Our 38 in this format, you might want a hollow point to prevent extreme over penetration. So let's pull these bullets out of the block. We'll take a close-up look at them. I'm going to shoot a steel target and see what kind of practical accuracy and shootability I can get with these. All right, here's a close-up look at these bullets. Here's our 38 special. Here's our 32 long. And looking at our 38 special, we have a concave base there. And also, it appears to be a harder cast bullet, just because the length of that bullet does seem longer than typical. So when it tumbles through, it's going to be cutting a bigger hole than most expanded hollow points when it yaws through like that. But it's not predictable. So, you know, sometimes it might work well, so other times it might not be as effective. It has a big bullet. Now our 32 long, same thing here. But this one was light enough and it has a flat enough nose that it resisted that yawing, is the flat nose. So that actually is a pretty good design for that power level, for getting good terminal ballistics with that 32 long. Now going through our real world simulation here, 38 special, 32 long, and both of these, you know, took on just a little bit of damage there where they took on the pattern of that fabric, deformed a little bit going through the rib simulation. The 32 kind of bent a little. But again, those are pretty hard bullets. It didn't really deform that much. So that's a close-up look at those bullets. All right, 14 yards from the target, our practical shootability distance here. And you know, these are revolvers. I think revolvers are fine options for self-defense. A lot of people say, well, capacity is so low, they're worthless. Yet 5 rounds is the high-end average of shots fired in self-defense in your average situation. So the average is 3. So if you have 5 shots, most of the time it's going to work. Now there's going to be obviously outlier situations where 5 isn't enough, but most of the time for most people 5 is enough. So let me see what I can do here. Let's get a front sight picture and pop these off as fast as I think I can hit the target and see how our 38 special does. All right, let's get quite a bit of recoil for 38 because it is kind of a warmly loaded load. So 32 long, let's see how this does. And that's like night and day. That is very easy to shoot. Barely more recoil than a 22 Magnum or something like that. So let me back it up and shoot from some distance and see how these do from a little more distance. All right, 75 yards from the target just for fun. There's really no practical purpose for this. And the reason why this is fun for me is a lot of times in the past when I back up even a little bit, people would say, well, snub nose revolvers are belly guns. You can't hit anything beyond card table distances. I used to get that a lot. And that's what always inspired me to do this little bit longer range shooting, because I found that funny. Because even if I can't realistically hit all the time, it's fun just to kind of see where they might land. So let's see what I can do here with our 38 special from 75 yards. I don't know where that one went. Yeah, I'm having a hard time determining where these are going. Alright, let's see. One that I hit kind of low, pretty much point of aim. I'll keep trying. That one hit really high. All right, so not very consistent at that distance because I saw some shoot over the target by several feet. And then the other ones were hitting like point of aim. So I think we're just kind of destabilizing at that distance, being a round nose. So 32 long. Let's see how this stuff does for me. I would hit quite a bit to the right. Again, really far to the right. And to the right again. So these are consistently hitting to the right. So I'm going to aim off the target to the left a little bit. Alright. I'll continue that hold, see if I can keep making hits. Alright, so I just had the hold high left. And once I did that, that's pretty accurate overall. So interesting here looking at this ammo. So one thing that stands out about this is that I test so many different rounds of ammo all the time. I'm testing all kinds of hollow points. And with certain calibers, because you have the velocity, hollow points generally always work right. Like 9mm plus P, 357 Magnum, light for caliber 40s, light for caliber 45s through a 5-inch barrel, 38 plus P through a 4-inch barrel. But a lot of times when you come down to like snub nose revolvers and it's not a Magnum, you start having a lot of issues getting hollow point expansion. You know, 32 long hollow points, 32 H&R Magnum hollow points, 38 special and 38 special plus P hollow points, even 9mm hollow points through 9mm revolver. You start having trouble getting hollow point expansion because you're not getting the ideal velocity. And when you look at something like this didn't do that bad. Now if you look at like a short barrel 9mm and you use a full metal jacket, those will over penetrate. Same thing with a lot of different cartridges, they really over penetrate because they're full metal jacket. But when you bring the energy down to what we're working with here and you use a lead bullet, that's not bad performance at all. So you could do a lot worse. And I'm gonna say, I think that you could like do all your research and try to find the best 22 Magnum out there. You could, low recoil, I get a 22 Magnum gold dot, I get this or that revolver. I'm trying to, this 32 long, just being a lead round nose with a flat point, this 32 long has pretty much the same recoil as a 22 Magnum, and it's gonna perform better, and it's cheaper, it's easier, all of that. So sometimes stuff like this is a good option, and I'm going to say this 32 long is actually a really good option if you have issues with recoil. This 38 was a little bit too hot. It had very high recoil, higher than a typical 38 special, and that is just because it is likely a CIP spec. There's another funny note here. I talked to a lot of people that are like, I have a Smith, an old Smith, or I have a Charter Arms, and I can't run plus P through it, so I need to run standard pressure. And what I'm running through it now is I'm running SNB or Fiocchi or whatever, and they're getting these high numbers of energy, and they're like, the energy is higher than American. And it's like, American 38 special plus P maxes out at 20,000 psi. CIP, European standard pressure, maxes out at something like 21,700, a higher pressure than American plus P, and they think they're safe doing that, and they won't run a plus P. That's a story for another day. But I think this is a good option to run lead round nose versus maybe a hollow point that won't expand. Law enforcement did it for a long time effectively. So that's what you get today. So as always, comment, share, and like, and thanks for watching.